folksy friends, and on this channel I talk Tolkien lore. Today we are talking about the far west part of Middle-earth, a realm called Beleriand in the First Age, just before the terrible Battle of Sudden Flame. This video is essentially an introduction or background, you could say, to that battle. And to begin with, we will talk about the Noldor. The Noldor were the most powerful of the elves in Middle-earth, save for King Thingol himself, but more on him later. The Noldor were ruled over by the House of Finwë, who was their very first king. This group had lived, and most of them in fact had been born, in the blessed realm of Valinor. And this family consisted of Fingolfin as the current High King, his children, Fingon and Turgon, and the children of his brother, Finrod, Angrod, Angnor, and Galadriel, as well as the children of his half-brother, Maedhros, Maglor, Celegorm, Caranthir, Curufin, and Amrod and Amras. The key players here are Fingolfin himself as the current High King, Maedhros as the head of the House of Feanor, and Finrod as the head of the House of Finarfin. Now, before coming back to Middle-earth, the Noldor had suffered a devastating attack by the great evil Morgoth, during which they lost their king. And in order to avenge him, they followed the king's eldest son, Feanor, and left Valinor. It was because of Feanor's wrath and grief over the death of his father that he was impatient, and when ships to sail to Middle-earth were denied him, he led a terrible slaughter of elves in Valinor. This was the first kinslaying, the killing of a group of elves called the Teleri. However, not all the Noldor participated with Feanor in this battle. The children of Finarfin fought on the side of the Teleri because their mother was Teleri. They tried to stop the Noldor from killing the elves for their ships. However, they were unsuccessful and the ships were stolen. Shortly after the kinslaying, the Noldor received a terrible prophecy saying that the House of Feanor was banished, and any elf that followed them would be under a dark fate. Despite this, however, most elves did continue to follow Feanor. On the journey to Middle-earth, during a time of tension and mistrust, Feanor and his sons stole the ships that the Noldor were going to use to get across the sea and abandoned Fingolfin and Finarfin's families. Once they reached Middle-earth, Feanor had the ships burned, stranding Fingolfin and Finarfin's families. They then had no choice but to cross the grinding ice in the furthest north to get to Middle-earth, and this journey cost many, many lives. On to the elves that actually lived in Middle-earth. This was a group of elves that originally had been part of the Teleri, part of the group that had been killed in Valinor. But these elves had never made it to Valinor. They had never left Middle-earth. They were ruled over by Thingol and his wife, Queen Melian. For thousands of years, the Sindar had lived spread across Beleriand in relative peace. But once Morgoth had returned, he began launching attacks, and Thingol called his people into the forests around his capital city, and his wife, Queen Melian, put up a magical protective border around those forests. There was also another group of Sindar that survived these attacks, and they lived on the coast, the Falas. These elves were protected in their cities of Eglorest and Brithambar, and they were led by Círdan the Shipwright. Morgoth was launching these attacks on the elves from his fortress of Angband in the far north. This fortress was separated from Beleriand by the field of Argalan and the highlands of Hithlum, Dorthonion, and Lothlan. When Feanor and his people arrived on their ships, they had crossed through Hithlum and towards Angband. Feanor himself was killed pretty quickly after arriving in Middle-earth. Not long after his death, the people of Fingolfin and Finarfin, who had survived the crossing of the Helcaraxe, also entered Hithlum, and they all drove back the orcs to Angband. However, tensions were not great among the Noldor, because the House of Feanor had abandoned the others, who had then suffered greatly. Thingol himself was not very happy that there were suddenly a lot of Noldoran elves just in his lands, but he did not leave his realm of Doriath. Although he wanted these new elves to respect his rules and accept him as king of these lands, he did allow them to settle in the northern parts of Beleriand. However, none of the Noldor were allowed within Doriath except for the children of Finarfin.
and so Finrod and Galadriel went to live with him. And this was because they were his great niece and nephew. After the death of Feanor, the current High King, Fingolfin, decided to stay in Hithlum, the area that the Noldor had first arrived in. He set up his rulership in the area of Mithrim, and his eldest son also stayed in Hithlum, taking over the area of Dor-lomin. Their seat of power was the city Ethel Sirion, and this was within the mountains of Ered Wethrin that looked out towards Angband, so that Fingolfin was able to always keep watch on what Morgoth was doing. Fingolfin's second son took over the area of Nevrast and created a home for himself near the sea in a place called Vinyamar. In the beginning, there was relative peace between the Noldor and the Sindar, although, as I said, only the children of Finarfin were allowed within Doriath. Of the children, in particular, Galadriel became pretty close with Queen Melian, and it didn't take long for Melian to have a feeling that Galadriel was hiding something, because she never spoke of the time after the death of the trees. Though when Melian asked her about this, she did not say anything. She simply said she wanted to start life anew here. Finrod, on the other hand, was welcome with open arms and had a good relationship with King Thingol. Finrod himself was a great peacekeeper among not only the Noldor, but the Noldor as a whole and King Thingol. Not long after settling in Middle-earth, Finrod and his friend Turgon took a trip further south from where they lived at the time. It was during this trip that they were visited by the Valar of Deep Waters, Ulmo, who gave them prophetic dreams that a terrible future was coming and they needed safe cities. With the help of Thingol, Finrod found a cave system and decided to have his mansions built there. There was created his home of Nargothrond, and he ruled over most of the west of Beleriand. He had a good relationship with not only the House of Fingolfin to the north, but also Thingol and his court to the east. Turgon, as I mentioned, had been living at Vinyamar, but with the help of Ulmo, he discovered a new area, an area that was in the encircling mountains, completely hidden from all those who didn't know it was there. And within this area, Turgon began building his secret kingdom of Gondolin. This city would be completely protected by mountains, and only those who knew the secret way would be able to access it. However, during the building of Nargothrond and Gondolin, rumors began to spread among the Sindar about the kinslaying, and these rumors were twisted with the lies of Morgoth. Melian asked Galadriel what she was hiding, but all of the Noldor were reluctant to bring up the kinslaying. Even so, the children of Finarfin, who had tried to stop it, who had fought on the side of the Teleri, and this was because they were worried about what would happen with their relationship with Thingol. However, when Thingol heard the rumors from Círdan, he summoned the sons of Finarfin to tell him the truth. Finrod, as I said, was reluctant to tell Thingol what had happened, but his brother Angrod remembered that years ago, one of the sons of Feanor, Caranthir, had insulted Angrod's mother at a council of the Noldor, and because of this, Angrod told Thingol everything. At hearing what had happened to the Teleri, his friends and family in Valinor, Thingol was furious. He completely outlawed the speech of the Noldor. He also completely detached any relationship, although there hadn't really been much of one, between his people and the sons of Feanor. The only reason the relationship between Thingol and the House of Fingolfin was not destroyed was because the people of Fingolfin had suffered in the crossing of the Helcaraxe, and Thingol saw that as a sort of penitence to what had happened. Thingol also continued to be supportive of the House of Finarfin, despite the fact that he was very angry, because they were related, and because they had tried to stop the attack. However, this further damaged the relationship that Thingol had with the Noldor, and it was very unlikely that Thingol would have anything to do with supporting them in the future. After 52 years, Gondolin was finished, and Nargothrond had been finished several years before. These great cities were ready to withstand any great attack that Morgoth might launch on Middle-earth. Gondolin itself remained a complete and utter secret. It was populated entirely of elves, those from the House of Fingolfin, and a lot of the Sindar as well. and no one was allowed to leave the city who knew how to get there. Now, there were a few ways to get from Angband, where Morgoth was, down into Beleriand, and one of these ways was between the area of Hithlum, controlled by Fingolfin, and the mountains where Gondolin was hidden. There was a pass here where the river Sirion flowed. And because this was a weak spot, Finrod had a defensive structure built in the middle on a little island, and he gave control of this area, which was called Tol Sirion, to his nephew, Orodreth. To the east of Hithlum was the highlands of Dorthonion, a very difficult place to live, but important to keep control of because it looked straight out across the fields to Angband. And in this area were the twins Angnor and Angrod. And now let's talk about the humans, the men that supported them. In Dorthonion, as well as the twins, was the house of Beor. They were given control of a little area called Ladros, and their chieftain at the time was called Bregolas. He was a descendant of the original leader of their house who had led men into Beleriand for the first time, and this family was very loyal to the house of Finarfin. Now, in Dorlomin, the area ruled over by Fingon, another group of men had settled, and these people were originally known as the people of Merak, but were now ruled over by a man named Hador. And during the rulership of Hador, they were given official lands and titles in Dorlomin. Fingolfin, like Finrod, had seen potential in the strength of men and wanted to keep them close as allies. The final group of men to have arrived in Beleriand were the Haladin. However, now they were known as the House of Haleth. Haleth had been the warrior who had led them from their original settling place in Thargelion and across to the forest of Brethil after they had been attacked by orcs. They protected their forest with great strength, and not even orcs dared to go in there because they knew that they would be taken down by the people of Haleth. However, the people of Haleth did not get involved in the affairs of others, and they did not tend to leave their forest, so they wouldn't be a lot of help against any future attacks by Morgoth. At the time period I'm speaking of, they are now led by a man named Halmir. As I mentioned, when men first arrived, they were welcomed by the Noldor, but Thingol himself was not very happy to see them. Of all the Noldor, only Finrod spoke to Thingol about the men traveling across Beleriand, and once again Thingol felt insulted to have not been consulted, as he was considered still king of Beleriand. He told Finrod that the Noldor could keep their men in Noldor lands only, and that the Noldor were responsible for them. Finally, on to the most tricky group of elves that lived in Beleriand, and these were the sons of Feanor. The sons of Feanor were ruled over by their eldest brother, Maedhros. His level-headedness that kept his more intense brothers from causing any more harm among the Noldor. The sons of Feanor protected the entire area to the northeast, known as the Marches, and they had already faced attacks by orcs, so they had a pretty good idea of how to defend their land. To the south of where the sons of Feanor lived were the Lequendi, and these elves were complete pacifists. And just to the east, in the mountain range of Ered Luin, were the Dwarves, in their cities of Nogrod and Belagost. And the Dwarves only took part in fights when the orcs strayed a little too close. In their time in Middle-earth, the Noldor protected Doriath from Morgoth, and they did a pretty good job at it. They kept watch over Angband, leading a siege that would ensure that they all knew if Morgoth tried anything. And despite tensions, there was cooperation. Maedhros not only abdicated the throne for Fingolfin, he also gave Fingolfin some of his best horses, and this allowed Fingon, the son of Fingolfin, to create an impressive cavalry. It was because of the leadership of Maedhros that much of the cooperation between the sons of Feanor and the rest of the Noldor happened. Overall, in the west of Middle-earth, Thingol was king, but Doriath and the Falas were pretty closed off. They did not interact all that much with the Noldor. The dwarves only fought when the orcs came near, and the Lequendi would not fight at all. The Noldor were strong, but they were mostly at odds with Thingol and one another, except for the House of Finarfin. This house was really the glue that held together the Noldor and the Sindar. For any future attack, it would be the Noldor and the men supporting them that would keep Morgoth at bay. And if anything ever happened to break the defenses of the Noldor, it would be all of Beleriand that suffered. For the time being, the land was protected, but Morgoth was gathering strength, and the peace among the elves was fragile.
Thank you for spending some time with me here today as I talked about Tolkien lore. Next time, I am going to be talking about Dagor Bracolach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, essentially what this video has been leading up to. That video will be in 2 weeks, but in the meantime, I'm hoping to upload some smaller videos that will go more in depth about some of the things I talked about today. For example, the people of Haleth, their story. Also, a more detailed situation of what went down once men arrived and made camp in the area of Astalad, because there was some tricksiness going on from Morgoth at that time. And then also talking a little more in depth about the relationship between Galadriel, Melian, and how the whole situation with finding out about the kinslaying happened. So I hope you'll join me for those and for my larger video about the Battle of Sudden Flame. Again, thank you so much for spending some time with me here today, and I will see you next time.